thought they could silence her with a fine, a brutal $15,000 penalty, dropped like a hammer before she could even speak. It wasn't just money, it was humiliation, a warning shot meant to break her spirit and set an example. But Jasmine Crockett doesn't break, she fights. And what happened in that courtroom would not only shake one judge's authority, but ignite a movement across the nation. It began in the middle of a routine procedural hearing, the kind of day where nothing extraordinary is expected. Yet in that silence of shuffled papers and cold legal jargon, Judge Monroe leaned forward with a look that made the room tense. Without warning, he declared Jasmine's client guilty of violating a code and issued a $15,000 fine, swift, merciless, and without trial. No witnesses, no evidence, not even an argument allowed, just a decree from the bench. Why did he do it? Because it wasn't about the law, it was about control. Judge Monroe had grown irritated with Jasmine, her sharp tongue, her unwillingness to bow, her reputation for dismantling weak cases with precision. To him, this was personal. He wanted to make an example of her, to show everyone that no matter how brilliant she was, his courtroom was still his domain. The blow landed hardest on her client, an ordinary citizen who had come in expecting fairness and left with a crushing debt. But Jasmine felt the weight too. She knew the law, and she knew what had just happened wasn't justice, it was abuse. The question was, how would she respond? Calmly, firmly, Jasmine rose. She requested the chance to present her defense, to speak the truth that was being smothered by judicial arrogance. But Monroe cut her off with a smirk. His words sliced through the air. This court does not need to entertain speeches or stall tactics. With that, he waved her away, dismissing her as if she were a child out of place. The room froze. Everyone could see what was happening. A judge was using the weight of the bench not to uphold law, but to crush dissent. Jasmine, standing there with her client's fate in her hands, realized something chilling. This wasn't about codes or citations. This was about contempt. He wanted her humiliated, silenced, erased. But Jasmine Crockett doesn't fold under pressure. If anything, the heat makes her sharper. With her heart steady and her mind blazing, she began to outline her defense, not with pleading words, but with weapons of law itself. She would not appeal to Monroe's sympathy. She would expose his weakness. She would show that even in his own courtroom, the Constitution held more power than his pride. This was no longer just a case. It was a battle between authoritarian will and the rule of law. And Jasmine was about to make sure everyone saw which side she stood on. Jasmine knew Judge Monroe expected her to sit down, defeated. But instead, she planted her feet firmly on the courtroom floor and did what she does best. She fought with the law itself. Her voice, steady but sharp, cut through the silence. She wasn't just defending her client, she was dismantling the very foundation of Monroe's ruling. She began with precedent, cases etched into the fabric of American justice. Sullivan v. State of Illinois, she cited, her tone unwavering. That case overturned fines imposed without evidence because justice cannot survive on presumption alone. Then she brought up Henderson v. City of St. Petersburg, another victory against unchecked power, where a court declared that financial penalties without verifiable proof were unconstitutional. Why these cases? Because they revealed the truth Monroe wanted buried. His ruling wasn't rooted in law, it was rooted in ego. Jasmine made the courtroom see it. The parallels were undeniable. Each word she spoke was a reminder that the Constitution is not optional, not something a judge can sidestep when it suits him. Everyone could feel the shift. What had begun as Monroe's performance of power was now unraveling. His face stiffened, his gavel tapped nervously. He could dismiss her once, but he couldn't erase history nor silence the Constitution. Her words landed harder than any outburst could. She forced Monroe to confront a brutal fact. This wasn't justice, this was authoritarianism in judicial robes. She said it plainly, boldly, without hesitation. And in that moment, the judge's confidence cracked. His glare faltered. The weight of her argument was too sharp to ignore. Then something happened that no one expected. Monroe leaned back, cleared his throat, and called for a 15-minute recess. On the surface, it looked like routine procedure, but Jasmine saw it for what it was, a tactical retreat. The man who had tried to silence her was now scrambling to gather himself, hiding behind the formality of a break. That recess was more than a pause. It was the moment the courtroom realized Monroe wasn't as untouchable as he appeared. His arrogance had collided head-on with a wall of precedent and principle, and now he needed time to breathe, time to plot his next move. Jasmine didn't waste those 15 minutes. She leaned over to her client, reassuring them that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. To the outside eye, it looked like calm conversation. But inside, she was already building her next strike, preparing for the inevitable escalation that was coming once Monroe returned. Because one thing was certain, When they reconvened, this wouldn't just be Monroe versus Jasmine anymore. He would call in reinforcements, he would shift tactics, he would do everything to claw back his authority. And Jasmine Crockett was ready for every single move. This was no longer about $15,000. It was about principle, about power, and about proving that one fearless woman could stand against a system that thought it could silence her. When the gavel struck again, the atmosphere in the courtroom was no longer the same. The recess had been more than a pause, it was a recalibration. Judge Monroe returned, but this time he wasn't alone. Sitting beside him now was Judge Thomas Whitaker, a senior federal overseer with a reputation for precision and integrity. His presence told the whole story. Monroe had called in backup. Why? Because Monroe knew his authority had been pierced. He needed someone with weight, someone who could restore order to a battle that was slipping from his grip. Whitaker wasn't there to replace him, only to guide, but his very presence shifted the balance of power. Everyone could feel it. It was Whitaker who spoke first, his tone measured and commanding. He asked Jasmine to restate her core argument, giving her the floor Monroe had tried to deny. And this time, the courtroom leaned in, waiting to see how she would answer in front of a second, sharper set of eyes. Jasmine didn't waste the moment. She didn't just repeat her points, she escalated. She called Officer Nathan Ellis, the man who had written the citation, to the stand. The courtroom stirred. Monroe's decision had rested entirely on Ellis's report. If Jasmine could crack his testimony, the entire case would collapse. Ellis walked to the witness stand with the stiff shoulders of a man hiding doubt. Jasmine's questions came crisp and relentless. First, she asked if he had taken photographs to document the alleged violation. His answer, no. Then she pressed if he had filed a detailed written report beyond the citation slip. Again, no. Finally, she asked if there had been any witnesses, anyone at all, to corroborate his claim. His silence said everything. What remained was devastating. No photos, no report, no witnesses, just one man's opinion in uniform. The courtroom air turned heavy, like everyone realized at once that the emperor had no clothes. Jasmine didn't need theatrics. She simply concluded, this fine isn't built on evidence, it's built on opinion. And opinion, no matter how neatly dressed in a badge, cannot be the foundation of justice. Her words hit with precision. Monroe shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Whitaker's expression hardened, his pen scratching notes with sharp strokes. The spectators in the gallery exchanged glances. Everyone could see the unraveling. This wasn't just a defense anymore, this was an exposure. Jasmine had peeled back the layers of power to show that the $15,000 fine wasn't a punishment rooted in fact, it was nothing but arbitrary authority given form by a rubber stamp. And with the entire courtroom now aware, the battle reached its peak. Monroe still had one chance to defend himself, but he knew he would not be speaking only to Jasmine anymore. He would be speaking under the watchful eye of Whitaker, and through him, the weight of federal oversight itself. The stakes had officially shifted. What began as a local skirmish was about to echo far beyond this one courtroom. The silence that followed Officer Ellis's testimony was crushing. Everyone in the courtroom knew what it meant. There was no evidence, no foundation, no justice behind the $15,000 fine, but Jasmine wasn't finished. She wanted the weight of this truth to land in full. She turned back to the bench and did something Monroe hadn't expected. She told stories. 3 stories to be exact, each about ordinary people who had been crushed under the same kind of unchecked authority that now sat exposed in this room. One was a single mother in Chicago who lost her job after an arbitrary fine forced her to choose between paying the city or feeding her kids. Another, a retired veteran in Florida, who nearly lost his home after a false citation drained his savings. And the third, a young man in Texas, whose dreams of starting a business collapsed under the weight of penalties that were never backed by evidence. Why these stories? Because they weren't abstractions. They were flesh and blood proof that unchecked power doesn't just bend rules, it breaks lives. And Jasmine made sure everyone understood that what Monroe had tried to do here today wasn't an isolated act. It was part of a pattern. Monroe bristled. He leaned forward, clinging to the only defense he had left, judicial discretion. This court, he declared, has the authority to exercise judgment in cases where clarity is lacking. My decision falls under that discretion. But before Jasmine could even respond, Whitaker intervened. His voice was steady, firm, and final. Judicial discretion cannot override constitutional standards. Authority ends where evidence begins. The words landed like a gavel before the gavel. Monroe's face hardened, his pride cracking under the weight of federal oversight. For a moment, the room watched as a man who had wielded unchecked power was forced to confront the limits of his reach. Finally, with a heavy exhale, Monroe relented. He vacated the fine. He dismissed the charge, and in a voice that betrayed his frustration, he admitted there was insufficient evidentiary support to sustain the penalty. It was over. The $15,000 fine that had begun as an act of arrogance was gone, crushed beneath the very laws Monroe thought he could bend. But Jasmine's victory didn't stay within those four walls. News of the case spread quickly, reaching communities across the nation. Municipalities began to question their own practices. Thousands of arbitrary fines were reviewed, challenged, and overturned. For countless citizens, what happened in that courtroom became a spark of hope, a reminder that justice, when defended with courage, could still prevail. And at the center of it all was Jasmine Crockett, the woman they tried to silence with $15,000, who instead turned the tables and sparked reform. Her comeback wasn't just legendary, it was precedent. Because in the end, she didn't just defend her client. She defended every citizen who had ever been told to pay, shut up, and accept injustice. And that is why this story will be remembered not as a fine that was levied, but as a system that was forced to change. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, where power gets challenged and truth rises above lies, then subscribe to State of Lies. Join us and never miss justice unfolding.